Thank you very much, and it's really terrific to come here today. I hadn't quite anticipated that the lunch would be so good as well, so that's a bit of a bonus. Can I begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. And secondly, to say that we have got to, there are going to be some photos that I share with you, but I'll try to talk the pictures as well as show the pictures, just to give you a little bit of insight into the work that we do across the world. And I'll try to speak into the microphone. Yes. How do I get this one? There we go. Okay, thank you. So it is an opportunity for me just to talk about Oxfam's work and to share some of the stories. And in doing so, I guess this is kind of a poignant moment for me because I will be leaving the post in mid-August after having had 6.5 years in the role. And I truly have to say that it's been the most incredible 6.5 years to be part of a global organisation which at its heart has a very strong agenda supporting equality and working to eradicate poverty across the world. So Oxfam Australia, which is just down the road, is the green building near the law school, is part of what we call a global confederation. So we have 20 members across the world, as well as having an international secretariat. And the way that we work is that we certainly do long-term development work, and I'll share some of that with you. We're part of the humanitarian response community, so where there's conflict, where there's cyclone, where there's Ebola, all of those things that we hear about on the news, then we're part of that response. But the thing that perhaps differentiates us is that we believe if we're actually going to eradicate poverty, and if we are going to work to empower people across the world, then we have to tackle some of the big systemic challenges that exist either locally or globally. And to that end, we are unashamedly an advocacy organisation, and that operates at different levels. So, for example, in relation to some of the big global challenges, we've identified climate change as one of the biggest challenges to preventing people getting out of poverty. We've also identified inequality as a major concern globally, not because we resent people being rich, but the gap between the rich and the poor is getting much bigger. And we believe that that traps people in a very different kind of poverty cycle to the one that we've seen in the last 5 decades. And we also are very concerned about the role of women globally, and increasingly concerned at rates of violence, the lack of representation of women in what should be a very contemporary world. So I'm just going to tell you some stories, and I should have asked how long, Kurt?
Until about 10.
Okay, good. Well, if I go on, then turn off the mic. So at the heart of what we do believe that all people are entitled to live their life in a way that they can determine. So that we think that equality is a really important value which drives our work. And we claim to be a human rights organisation, and there are various ways that we try to manifest this concept of equality. So a lot of our work is actually working with communities to think about how does that translate in their communities. What do they tell us that they believe they want to concentrate on? So this is actually, it's a beautiful photo of women who are marching down the main street of Port Vila in Vanuatu. And the purpose of this is that we provided some assistance through our civil society partner organisations in Vanuatu to help women get together to think about political representation. And this was not us starting a women's political party, but what those women identified was that it was time for Vanuatu to have a women's political party, and that women needed to be at the political decision-making table. And this was a very joyous march with, you might be able to see drums and various other instruments where the women really came out to say, we're launching this political party, we're going to be participating in elections, and we want to have a seat at the table in terms of decision making. Now, Oxfam's part in that was to support and work with. So as I said, it's not up to us to go to Vanuatu and say, we think you need a women's political party. But if what they're saying is we want gender equity, we want women to have equal rights, how can you help us to do that as an organisation that can help us get funding, help us mobilise, to give us technical expertise? So equality across the board is really important, and gender equality is really important. The Oxfam in Australia was set up as Community Aid Abroad, and many of you would be very familiar with Community Aid Abroad. And for the Sydney siders who may have had some time up there, it was Freedom from Hunger. So we've been in Australia for 60 odd years, and that story is a wonderful story again of a group of people deciding that people shouldn't live in poverty, and that Australia had a role to play overseas. We then joined the Oxfam group at the turn of the century and rebranded to become part of a global organisation which is now Oxfam. And of course Oxfam began in Oxford towards the end of the Second World War, where a group of people in Oxford, and again it came very much from a Christian base, people who were concerned about the blockades of the Greek islands and the fact that people were dying of starvation, and that humanitarian aid from Western countries was not allowed to get through. So the first act of Oxfam, in its very early genesis, was to defy Winston Churchill and to say the humanitarian imperative overrides any other consideration, and these people shouldn't be starving, and they organised food to get through. So that Bolshevik kind of attitude, that very single focus attitude around putting people at the heart of our business, is one that continues to drive our work today. I mentioned that we certainly do some very traditional long-term development programs, but we do try to actually look at what are the causes of poverty. Now, this is a young woman who works in a clothing factory in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and one of the things that the country program in Bangladesh revealed to us was the circumstances in which predominantly women garment makers are working. And you'll recall about 6 years ago there was a horrific accident in Dhaka where one of the buildings concertinaed down on itself, and 1,000 garment workers were squashed to death. They were killed. And they were killed because safety regulations hadn't been met. They were killed because there were iron bars on the windows and they couldn't escape when they knew the building was collapsing. And they were killed because there was no regulation of a huge industry in Bangladesh. So we began work at that time in Australia with the Australian garment industry. And we said our mission is to eradicate poverty, but we believe that the private sector in Australia has also got a role to play in ensuring that when it sources garments from a country like Bangladesh, that they know who's making the garments, what their living and working circumstances are, and to set the trend. And this is not something that's just coming from Australia, it's coming globally. So fashion in Australia, even with the challenges of retail at the moment, is a $27 billion industry. And we've had some really promising and encouraging responses from some of the brand names where you think they wouldn't be interested in this, they would only be interested in price. So for example, Kmart and Target, both very cheap brands, were the first to actually sign up to the Bangladeshi Accord for safety for garment workers. They were the first to actually say we're going to commit to paying a living wage to garment workers and to publish their roadmap for doing that. And of course, once you get one person leading or one company leading the pack, it's possible then for others to join. And we've seen that other very, very strong brands in Australia like Cotton On and others have also joined. Now, Australia's sourcing from Bangladesh is a rounding error. You know, we're a tiny market compared to some of their global markets. But it's really critical that this is contributing to a different way to eradicate poverty. So we don't say boycott, we don't say stop sourcing from there, we say this is the livelihood for millions of people in Bangladesh. This is a fundamental part of the GDP for that country, which is a very poor country, a very disaster-prone country. So what we should be doing from the Australian perspective is trying to ensure that the conditions in which these people work are actually improved to make a difference. And we continue to do work on this. It's very strongly evidence-based. It's driven from the perspective of interviews with civil society groups, with government in Bangladesh, with the workers, but we also use Deloitte Access Economics to do economic modelling on what would it cost, what would be the additional cost to a garment if you paid a living wage. And basically what that showed is that for a $10 t-shirt, if the workers that put it together were paid a living wage, it would add 10 cents to the price of that t-shirt. So an astonishing statistic which kind of then just took the lid off all of the kind of mystery around why these people can't ensure that they fight for a living wage for these workers. So really important and successful campaign. We believe that we're part of the working with communities. So of course every charity wants its brand to be recognised, and we're no different to that. But we work very strongly in coalitions, and we work very strongly to bring other people on the journey. So this is a rather funny picture, but there are a couple of politicians there. Claire Moore, who's the retiring opposition person for international development, and Sharon Clayton, who's the member for Newcastle. But this was a trip to Bangladesh where basically we wanted to show them firsthand what the garment worker factories were like. We wanted to show them the response to the Rohingya crisis, which I'll talk about a little bit further, so how complex the humanitarian response is. And the purpose of this is we wanted them to understand and hold the conviction that Australia has a role to play in international development. And many of you will know that we've had huge cuts to the aid budget, that the levels of aid as a proportion of gross national income have dropped horrifically in the last few years. And it's done on the basis of the myth of balancing the budget. And what very few people know is that what the Australian government spends on overseas aid is less than 1% of overall government expenditure. And we're really hoping that we can see a change and an improvement in those circumstances, although it's very challenging to get a strong commitment even from the opposition to reinstate the aid budget to its appropriate levels. So empower is a word that we use a lot, and it's used very loosely, I think, in these days, but with a human rights-based approach to our work, we really try to not impose solutions on people, but to actively listen and work with them, because ultimately what we want them to do is to have control of their own lives. So again, this is these photos are just beautiful, and I have to say it's just been such a privilege to go to many of these countries. And counterintuitively, I went to Pakistan last year, and I think it's probably going to rate as one of my favourite countries in the world, which kind of doesn't feel right because it's so unsettled on the western side of the country, bordering onto Afghanistan. But I was in Pakistan a week before the national election, so it was a week before Imran Khan, for all of those cricket lovers, you'll all remember him, was voted in as the Prime Minister. And it was a time of enormous volatility. So there were suicide bombers in the west side of the country, and there was the previous Prime Minister who'd come back who had was going to stand again. Enormous kind of volatility. But Oxfam in Pakistan worked with partner organisations on a program called She Can Lead. Now, I'll give you just a little bit of background because it gives you an idea that how we try to work with the flow of opportunity rather than come in with solutions. So the Electoral Commission in Pakistan, believe it or not, has gone through a major reform process where what they want to do is first of all encourage women to register to vote. So many women in villages and small towns are not recognised as having a right to vote by their families for traditional reasons, for religious reasons, and have never seen that they've had a role to play in determining who should lead in the country. So the Electoral Commission had set up quite a program of changing that. And there were three components. So get women registered to vote. So 8 million women out of 12 million unregistered, they had managed to get them registered to vote ahead of the national elections. The next thing was to actually get them to stand for political office as well. So register to vote, and to allow them to vote. There were separate women's streams that were set up so that women could feel safe when they go to the polling booths. And then they also decreed that every political party should allocate 5% of the candidates pre-selected to be women. Now, in Pakistan they do what they do here. They give the women the marginal seats and make them fight for it. But it's a start. It's a really important start. And we were able to be to see some of these women in local villages who were standing for local council, who were encouraging other women to vote, who were willing to be part of the process. And we were able to see that supported by the change in attitude to the men in those villages. And many of these towns, like Hyderabad, have, under the sort of a leftover of the British time of Pakistan, still have press clubs, for example, even in their small villages. And part of the program of the press clubs is to create a women journalist stream of activity so they could also have women journalists actually reporting on what's going on in the country. So incredible changes and just an amazing country in terms of the generosity of the people. And one of those trips that's always very bittersweet because you think, why can't this country be settled? And why do they have to deal with the conflict on their borders? We've seen some very interesting things happen recently. You'll all recall in the Punjab area where the Indian, I think it was a fighter plane, was shot down. And I was very, very surprised, pleasantly surprised to hear Imran Khan talk very sensibly to Modi in India to say we don't want to make this a big issue. We've both got big toys in our backyard, nuclear armaments, so let's try and resolve this a bit more convivially. And we need more of that. But anyway, a terrific program for us to be involved in. Amazing experience seeing these women, some of whom were not Muslim, some of whom are Hindu. One incredible woman who was so inspiring, who was fighting for the interests of women workers who were working in peace work, who were unrepresented and invisible, and that was her job to really try to bring their interests into the government. She'd been threatened. She'd had the ghouls, you know, the kind of bullies, tell her that she needs to stand down, that she needs to shut up. But she was quite resolute, and sadly, you know, she may be impacted sometime in the future. But it's that courage that, you know, we've all got the stories of people we know where an individual with courage actually changed the direction of history, and we continue to want to support that, and very excited if we can be part of it. Now, a lot of our work is actually humanitarian, and I guess the biggest response of late in our region has been in Bangladesh, and this was the response of the Rohingya people who flooded in from Myanmar into Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh on the border there, and I can never find the words to describe this. So first of all, if you think about the total population of, say, Canberra, amassing into an area that has no housing in under 3 months. So 600,000 or 700,000 people who crossed the border within the space of 3 months. And the early arrivals were given tarpaulin and a couple of bamboo sticks and told to go and dig a shelter. And this area of Cox's Bazar was once heavily forested, And as more people came, of course they needed to chop down trees for firewood to build their shelters. And this response has been massive. It has a number of interesting features. I mean, the long-term prospects for these people are just awful because they are very fearful about going back to Myanmar without any assurances from the government there that they won't again be persecuted. The Bangladesh Army played a very critical role, and because they're used to peacekeeping duties, they were actually very atypically trusted to a much greater extent than what you would expect. But I still can't describe what it's like when you stand and look out, and for as far as you can see, you can't see any vegetation, any trees, just these blue tarpaulins with bamboo covering and people sitting inside them. This is one of the pieces. We do traditional water and sanitation work, so, you know, wells and toilets, which is pretty critical when you get that many people together, and then the associated public health work that goes with that. But we also did a safety survey, and this is where I feel so humbled to have done this job. So when we were there, it was very, very hot, and it was just before the wet season, so the humidity was horrific. And people are living in plastic shelters, in effect, you know, no kind of electricity or any way to keep cool. And we went to speak to some women about their experiences. Without exception, women would either have witnessed violence, had experienced violence, including rape, or had seen family members killed. So this is an incredibly traumatised population who fled their country and hadn't felt safe. And we were invited into a tent, and I don't know about you, but I've got very Western hips, so the prospect of sitting cross-legged on the ground even now makes my eyes water. It's so painful. So we were given a little stool to sit on, and one of the women was telling the story of what had happened to her family with tears streaming down her face, but insisted on fanning me because it was so hot, because she was so concerned about my comfort. And this dignity and this generosity is replicated time and time again when we see these humanitarian responses. And I've seen it after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, when you visit people in the Zatari refugee camps, when you go and see what the after effects are of cyclones in the Pacific. The generosity of human spirit is incredible. So certainly, this will give you an idea of the what the camp looks like. So this is some months on, so some of these structures are starting to look more permanent. This is before the wet season, so all of those roads that have been basically ploughed into the landscape by the military turn into mud, and all of the steps that have been cut into the clay, of course, just become impossible to get across. And then one of the really big problems that we had to fix, which we were very proud to have done, is that the early latrines were put in very shallow waterways. And of course, once the wet season comes, then that contaminates any other water sources in the area. So we had to redo all of the latrines and dig bigger wells so that people could access safe drinking water. This whole area used to be forested, and it's now completely denuded. And one of the challenges was that families would send kids out to get firewood, and so the issues of child trafficking, sex trafficking, people grabbing kids, stealing kids to use for slave labour or to sell on the global market became a real safety concern, over and above other issues that this is quite a significant drug area as well. So amazing complexity, and to be part of these responses, you have to be very attuned to all of the complexities that these families are dealing with, and to understand what their experience is and how we create safe environments for them. Now, I mentioned that we're unashamedly we're a campaigning organisation, and one of the, in addition to climate change, one of the really big issues that we've spend a lot of research time on is in relation to the widening gap between the rich and the poor. So every year where the world business leaders meet in Davos, Oxfam now has a standing invitation to join that meeting. Our International Executive Director attends. Every year we update the figures about who are the top wealthiest people in the world and what the equivalence of their wealth is to the rest of the population. And the figures are just kind of very startling. So you might have 21% of the wealthiest people in the world who have as much wealth as the bottom poorest people in the world. So 21 people versus something like 3.5 billion people. And the concern for that is, as I said, it traps people into a poverty cycle, but it also concentrates power. And if you're going to make decisions about fixing things, then you want people who are making decisions not in their own interests. So how this translates in Australia is we do our own kind of local look at where power resides in Australia. But what we'd be more interested to do is to work with both the government and the opposition to get the sort of changes around tax avoidance by multinational countries and companies working offshore. And there have been some significant gains now where multinational companies have to report to the Australian Tax Office where they make their profit. The Australian Labor Party has agreed to country-by-country reporting and project-by-project reporting, so it's clear where they're operating in the world and where they're generating their profits. This is something that the mining sector already does. BHP is a leader in this space where they've developed the most transparent arrangements they can in terms of how they generate their wealth and what taxes they pay. And we believe that transparency is one way that we can actually deal with this challenging inequality. Some of the modelling that we've done actually shows that if taxes were paid in developing countries where, for example, extractives are taken, and if those taxes were used to build social protection services in those countries, then we wouldn't face some of the challenges we face today. So you'll remember in Sierra Leone about 4 years ago there was a massive Ebola crisis. And Ebola happens in Africa very frequently. For those of you with the health backgrounds, you would know that. And the reason it doesn't become a problem in Kenya or in Tanzania is because they have reasonable levels of public health systems. They're able to respond and manage an Ebola crisis themselves. In Sierra Leone there were no public health provisions, no kind of infrastructure to deal with this, and it's currently in DRC at the moment, and that's conflict-ridden as well, so that's even more complex to respond to. And yet in Sierra Leone, where there weren't basic public health services to protect their own people, they were paying massive subsidies to try to attract multinational companies to their country that were equivalent to what the health budget was for that country. And so again, the reason we go on about inequality is not to have a go at those who've been entrepreneurial enough to make money, but to say that if you pay your taxes, it should go into the sort of systems that are to all of our benefit, because it makes the world a bit safer and hopefully it makes the world a bit more stable. We're across many countries that have to speed up. I'll just give you little snapshots of some of the programs that we're involved in, and you'll get a sense of what the diversity is. This is in South Sudan, up in Unity State, so up in the northeast. People have fled the conflict from the north, walked for days on end through this swampy Nile marshland, and then they go to islands because they feel safe, women and children in the main. Our job is then to support them with livelihoods, building toilets, wells, etc. And the Australian government funded this canoe program, which was basically to train men and women to drive canoes that we purchased to allow the people on the islands to come into the main town, kids to go to school, health appointments, go to the market, get food and water. Very basic stuff. The most beautiful part of the world in any other context would be an eco-tourism kind of hotspot, but just so conflict-ridden. We also have a strong investment in Indigenous leadership here in Australia. We have run a program now for 10 years called Straight Talk. It's run by Aboriginal women. Once every 18 months, women who apply to go on a leadership course meet in Canberra. They're taught how to do project development, media work, lobby politicians. It has bipartisan support, so every workshop that we run is opened by the Foreign Minister, the Shadow Foreign Minister, and Rachel Seward from the Greens. And the women also have a day of lobbying where they meet with women politicians from their own areas and communities across Australia, and they develop that relationship to take back. But again, it's about empowering people to take things into their own hands and to deal with their own problems. I mentioned that we believe that corporations have a really important role to speak out. Historically, we've done a lot of work with the mining industry. We've done work with the banking industry. We're kind of stepping back from that now because they're a bit under pressure domestically. But their investment practices, the big four banks, have had investment arms overseas that have funded major agri-businesses that have pushed people off the land, that have resulted in deaths, in no compensations. And the research that we've done and taken back to the banks has resulted, I'm pleased to say, in certainly changes in their policy position. And we're still engaged with one of the banks to try to get compensation for families in Cambodia that missed out on their land. That's obviously one of the climate change marches. And I'm going to rip through these. That's just a beautiful, that's Papua New Guinea, you recognise that, and these incredible women who are part of some of the water programs. And this is actually in Lebanon. It's another country that I think I've fallen in love with. A fascinating country. I don't know, some of you will have been there, many of you would know the history. But this was, again, a DFAT funded project where small and medium enterprises were supported to employ Syrian refugees and the very poor in Lebanon. So again, a process of trying to give them livelihoods rather than just handouts. We rely on supporters normally we raise about 50 million a year from the Australian community to go into the work and to support the generation of work. We fund into about 20 odd countries. I was just saying to Kerry, it's very tight at the moment. Fundraising in Australia is a very hard job, but our supporters play a really key role. And I'm just conscious of time, so we'll skip through those last ones. So I guess the messages I would like to leave you with is that we're one of many organisations that has the privilege to work with communities across the world, both in long-term development and humanitarian response. We actually believe that if you want big change, you have to pull big levers for change, and that's why we focus on a number of areas, including climate change, gender equity, and global tax reform. I guess I feel very privileged to finish my full-time career in this role, and just struck, as I said, by the resilience of people across the world who deal with circumstances that are incomprehensible for many of us, and yet still have a generosity of spirit and a willingness to keep going. And I think to that end, our plea for all Australians to remember that we have an important role to play in the world, that we should have the ability as a relatively rich country to be generous to supporting people overseas and not only people within Australia. And we really hope that the Australian government after the election will reinstate the role that Australia should play as a generous community working with countries of the world. And I can assure you that Oxfam will continue to do that work now and into the future. But it's been a great privilege to share some of these stories with you, so thank you very much.